My name is Mark Handelman. I'm a lawyer, and before the inspector leaves, I just want to make a few comments about what she said. First of all, in my law practice on those occasions when I've had to deal with her colleagues, either from the OPP or other police forces, who protect, well, us from ourselves, for want of a better way to put it, it's to me quite remarkable the quality of work, the quality of concern that these police officers are bringing to our protection. When I was called to the bar 35 years ago, elder abuse didn't exist, it wasn't a crime, and domestic calls of any description were something that police officers hated to make. So we've taken great strides forward in police protection. My law practice involves people either of diminished capacity or alleged to be of diminished capacity, either because of mental illness or the various infirmities that come with age. I represent hospitals and community care access centers and facilities of other sorts, as well as individuals in cases in which a person's capacity to make their own decisions is an issue. That's a significant portion of my practice. Other lawyers retain me to go to hospitals and nursing homes to do wills and powers of attorney for people of questionable capacity. And if I have any claim to fame any longer, I suppose it's that I have litigated more end-of-life cases than probably any lawyer in Canada. So that's my background, and I'm here today not so much to talk about elder abuse in the sense of what other people do to us, but rather our own individual failure to pay attention to how we might end our lives or where we might end our lives. So can I just take a quick poll? Is there anybody here who does not think they're going to die at some point in time? Okay, I just would like to make sure that I'm talking to the right people. If you don't think you're going to die, feel free to leave. I don't really have that much to say to you. So, when does life end? This is a real happy topic for a Saturday afternoon, isn't it? Okay, we're going to beat up our old people and then we're going to let them die. When does life end? What's the legal definition of death? Anybody know? Well, guess what? There isn't one. You're dead when the doctor says you're dead. Okay? And so what about the medical definition of death? Well, there's two now, cessation of all brain activity and in the alternative, cessation of cardiac function. In other words, if your brain stops or your heart stops, you're dead. Well, actually, you're dead, but you're not officially dead until the doctor comes along and says you're dead. Because, you know, my grandparents used to know when somebody was dead. We don't anymore actually know when people are dead. And just by the way, the reason that we now use cessation of brain activity as well as cardiac death is because if you wait for somebody's heart to stop, then the rest of their organs aren't good enough to harvest for transplant purposes. So we created this new definition of death to protect those organs so that they can be recycled. And everybody is in favor of recycling, so nobody says anything about that. I come across very frequently doctors who use the phrase the dying process to indicate that somebody's condition is irreversible. They will not get better. They have lost any meaningful interaction with the environment around them, and they are fully dependent on others literally for everything. So, having said that, we should all be making our own decisions on how long we wish to linger. It's a scary thing to think about, but how do you know? I mean, if you know that you have cancer and you have a detailed conversation with your doctor about what lies ahead, that's one thing. But everybody here looks fairly healthy today, so I don't think anybody here knows when they're going to die or of what. So how do you do this? How do you say to the people who will be making these decisions for you when you're no longer able to, when it's time, if you will, to pull the plug? Okay, and just by the way, don't forget that what might kill us today might not kill us in 10 years. 100 years ago, the major cause of death were infectious diseases like pneumonia and influenza, now known as the flu. We're not afraid of it anymore. Lifespans reached into 50s and 60s and possibly 70 if you were lucky. 50 years ago, people died of things that now are, for the most part, day surgery. My father had one of the first heart bypass operations done in the world, and it was experimental surgery. And now it's sort of, okay, so you got to do a bypass operation, doc, and we're doing it on Monday. Should I cancel my tennis game for Wednesday, or will I be able to make it? And that's almost where we've come to on that. A lot of bypass operations are virtually day surgery today. So what future advances do we need to factor in for ourselves when we get to this point? And some people believe in miracles. Maybe not for themselves, but when they're praying for a loved one, treatment decisions, SDM means substitute decision maker, it's a legal term. I don't think a lot of us would make our own life decisions based on the prospect of a miracle, but I can't count how many times I come across people who are waiting for a miracle to save Grandpa. Keep him alive another day, God will intervene. And these are people who weren't religious until Grandpa went into the hospital. And, you know, we're lucky here in Canada to have funded health care, but the funding doesn't cover anything. What's it cost to park in a hospital parking lot for a day if you're spending the day with your spouse? Not to mention the horrible overpriced food that they give you in hospitals. Not to mention all of the other things that just the healthcare system doesn't cover. And so in the United States, you might have, if you're a moderately wealthy person, you might have enough money for 3 months in an intensive care unit. In Canada, that's $1 million a year. Well, we don't need to worry about that cost. We just need to worry about parking in the Sunnybrook parking lot. Okay, and so don't keep these conversations personal, because somebody's going to need to make your mind up for you if you're not able to do it for yourself. And when I talk about things changing, your own values and beliefs are going to change as well. I mean, when I was 30, if I'd written the power of attorney for personal care, it would have said, if I ever go gray, just shoot me. I've got a slightly different perspective on that today. Okay? And also, what have you been told and by whom? How much do you know about what might afflict you? There's a lot of presumption that people understand things that they don't necessarily understand. Everybody know what CPR stands for? Cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Anybody know what it's like to have CPR inflicted upon you? Well, because if you do, you're wiser than most people, because in a lot of hospitals, when the doctor says, if your grandfather's heart stops, do you want us to perform CPR? First of all, you're not getting enough information to make an informed decision. And secondly, a lot of people, when they hear that, what they think to themselves is, well, last Tuesday night on ER, I saw the crash cart go careening down the hall for the code blue. It went into Grandma's room, cut to a commercial. And 2 minutes later, there's Grandma, and she's come back to the hospital to thank the doctors for saving her life, and she's got a new hairdo, and she's looking like $1 million, and she's baked brownies for the doctors and the nurses. So sometimes when you say, do you want us to perform CPR, people smell brownies. You know, never mind Grandma didn't bake in her whole life. She not only got CPR, she learned how to bake brownies at the age of 96 in a hospital unit. People don't understand what CPR is. Frankly, doctors don't do a good job of explaining this either. So let's talk about somebody in particular, speaking of Sunnybrook, because Mr. Rizzoli went to Sunnybrook for apparently routine brain surgery. Did you know there was such a thing as routine brain surgery? Well, it really wasn't going to be a big deal for him. They were just going to shave his head, cut his skull open, carve out a benign tumor, glue him back together, and in a few days send him home. It was just going to be routine surgery. It was successful, except he got meningitis. And the consequence of that is He's left for the rest of his life, however long that may be, in the intensive care unit. His initial diagnosis was persistent vegetative state. Just by the way, I hate that phrase. I don't think people are vegetables at any point, but that's the medical jargon. And then he got upgraded to minimally conscious state. Either way, he is 100% dependent for other people on everything. And he's been there for 2.5 years. And his case is in the Supreme Court of Canada, and we're waiting for a decision. So what's missing from this story about Mr. Rizzoli? There's no evidence that Mr. Rizzoli had a power of attorney for personal care or had anybody suggest to him that he should. And I was in the Court of Appeal helping to argue this case on behalf of one of the interveners, and one of the judges stopped the lawyer for the doctors in the middle and said, "Excuse me for a moment. Your clients may think brain surgery can be routine, but didn't anybody talk about what might happen if things go wrong? Didn't anybody say to Mr. Rizzoli, just by the way, in case things go wrong, then we need to talk about your exit strategy?" And counsel for the doctors, who is a very good lawyer, said, "Your Honor raises a very good point, and I thank you for doing so. Now, if I may continue," and then just kept right on going through that, because there is no answer. And so I asked a friend of mine who's a surgeon about this, and he said to me, "Are you crazy? I want to talk about people ending up in a vegetative state or dying the day before I cut their head open to remove a tumor. I want people thinking positively. I want them thinking everything's going to be fine. I don't want them thinking about the worst. I'm not going to talk to them about that." And so I said, "Well, why doesn't the hospital have a policy?" And he said, "That's a very good question. What are you doing for dinner?" Hey. Mr. Rizzoli apparently didn't have a lot of discussions with his family about the what-ifs either, or with his surgeon. Didn't happen. And so now he's at a point where his lawyers can't do his power of attorney for him, where his doctors can't cure him, and it's too late to ask him. Fortunately for him, his family is absolutely certain they know enough of his values and beliefs to know exactly what he would want done in this circumstance. Unfortunately for Mr. Rizzoli, the doctors disagree with his family. And I know one thing that nobody wants is, at the end of the life of a loved one, to be in a pitched battle in the Supreme Court of Canada between yourself and the doctors who are caring for somebody, not to mention the cost of this process. It's just not a place that you ever want to be. So here's another happier story. I've got one with a happy ending, okay? Here's Mrs. I.A., and just by the way, the reason I'm not identifying her is because her story was never made public. Mr. Rizzoli, his story's been all over the newspaper now for 2.5 years. This lady is, I'm respecting her privacy, which, just by the way, is part of dignity, isn't it? Yes, ma'am.
Is there an actual point at which the Mr. Rizzoli case will get a quote-unquote decision?
We're going to get a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada as soon as they finish writing it. And
Can it be appealed?
Not past the Supreme Court of Canada. It's gone as far as it's going to go. The case was heard in the Supreme Court on December 10th, 2012, and we're a little surprised that they've taken this long, and I hope what they're trying to do is craft a decision that I can understand. Just by the way, I also have a master's degree in bioethics, so I look at these cases not only from the legal perspective, but also from the ethical perspective. And from both perspectives, they scare the wits out of me. My wife doesn't talk to me the day before I'm going to court to argue any side of an end-of-life case. Who am I to do this? Why didn't you do it for yourself when you had the chance? Although sometimes people do it for themselves, they just make a few other mistakes along the way, which I'll come to in a minute. In any event, here's Mrs. I.A., and she is in intensive care with kidney failure and with complications. She has no power of attorney. She does have 2 children. She has a son who is arguing with the doctors, keep mom alive. And she has a daughter who is arguing with the doctors, it's time to let mother die with some dignity. And that's not an uncommon thing either. And the only thing worse than having your family fight with your doctors over whether you should live or die is having your family fight among itself over whether you should live or die. And I have seen these battles taking place on the floor of an intensive care unit in a major teaching hospital, and it's ugly. So what happened here? Well, the reason son wants mom still alive is because he wasn't really all that good of a son, but since he's now been in jail for 5 years and 9 months of a 6-year sentence, if mom could only be kept alive for 3 more months, he'd be able to come and make his peace with his mother over his bad behavior. So that's his view of things, and daughter's view of things is, let mom die, sell the house, I need the damn money. So which one of those 2 kids do you want making your end-of-life decisions for you? Well, this case ended up going to the Consent and Capacity Board, which is a provincial tribunal that is unique in Canada, if not the world, that adjudicates cases like this and other cases that are similar to this. And in fact, when I was on the Consent and Capacity Board, I was the member who heard this case, and I made a decision in this case. What was my decision? Well, I decided her children couldn't agree, and her lawyers can't do a POA, and the doctors can't discern her wishes. And so what happened? At the Consent and Capacity Board, I didn't trust either of the kids. Okay, and as it turns out, this lady had no other relatives, and the consequence of that is because she has no family members, she has no power of attorney for personal care, she has no guardian of the person. In most cases like that, the decision defaults to public guardian and trustee, which is a provincial organization, part of the provincial government that is responsible for people who don't have people to care for them. And I should tell you that they do a remarkably good job to the extent that a civil servant can make a decision for anybody about anything. Damned with faint praise. In any event, at this hearing, I decided that neither party would act in mother's best interests. And so, as I say, the decision went to PGT. But guess what? Mrs. IA recovered. Now, she ended up still on dialysis, but she did recover and she was discharged. And sometime after I heard this case, I ran into the lawyer that was appointed to represent her through this hearing. I said, just by the way, whatever happened to Mrs. IA? And he said, well, she got a copy of your judgment and she read it with great interest. And guess what she did? Okay, so who decides whether or not you can decide for yourself? And I'm going to tell you, don't trust people to do this. Doctors don't know how to do this. Okay? Doctors are obliged to obtain informed consent before they treat you. Well, there's a legal definition of capacity to make a decision, because if you're not capable, you can't make a decision, right? There's a legal definition and there's a medical definition that a lot of doctors still use. The one that the doctors use essentially is, you're capable if you agree with me and incapable if you don't. Okay? Not exactly the right way to do it. But since a doctor needs to obtain informed consent, if you've lost capacity to consent on your own behalf, somebody else has to do it for you. And that would be your substitute decision maker. And capacity, and there are different capacities. One is the capacity to make your own treatment decisions. Another is the capacity to make decisions about admission to a care facility. Another is capacity to do a power of attorney for personal care. And another is to do capacity to do your own power of attorney for property. Separate from that is the capacity to manage your own care or to manage your own property. Now, just by the way, there's another definition of capacity in the law that some of you might be need to know one day, and it's capacity to marry. Watch out for this. You may have capacity to enter into a marriage, but have lost capacity to change your will, to do a new power of attorney. Okay? And just by the way, when you marry, your will becomes null and void. And when you marry, your new spouse is entitled to a significant hunk of your estate unless you have a marriage contract, which you may no longer have the capacity to get into. So watch out for young men like me courting young women like yourselves. So, different definitions for capacity. Okay, but essentially all of them require approximately the same sort of thing. They require that you have the ability to understand information that's relevant to the decision, and they require that you have ability to appreciate the consequences of making or not making the decision. In the case of a power of attorney for personal care, it requires that you understand that the person you're appointing to be your attorney has a genuine interest in your well-being and may have to make your decisions for you. So when my mother was in her early 80s, I thought I'd better talk to her about this. Mom, the day might come you can no longer make your own healthcare decisions. Who do you want to do it for you? And she said, well, you, of course, pointing at me. I said, well, Mother, I'm flattered, but what about my 3 older sisters? Mother said, oh, yeah, sure. Barbara will never pull the plug. Terry will pull the plug the first time I forget where I put my glasses. And Joyce will spend the rest of my life trying to get the two of them to agree, thereby establishing beyond any doubt she had the capacity to do a power of attorney for personal care, because that's the nature of the family dynamic. I said to her, but Mother, why are you picking me? Because I know you'll make the right decisions. Yeah, but Mother, how am I going to know what the right decisions are? You'll ask your sisters. My mother, by the way, had the good fortune and good sense at the age of 94 to die in her sleep in her own bed in her own home one day. Sign me up for this process, please, because I don't really want to do it in a hospital like approximately 95% of Canadians do today. So here are some things you need to think about. Your lawyer can't predict your illnesses or their course, determine what you might, when you might lose capacity to make your own decisions, predict what your substitute decision makers will do for you. Your doctor can't necessarily cure you, determine when you might lose capacity to make your own decisions, or predict what your substitute decision makers will do for you. So if you can't trust your doctor and your lawyer to figure these things out, who are you going to trust? Yourself, while you're still able to please. And here's just a few other things. Your doctor probably won't ask the probing questions required to ensure you pick the right attorney for personal care. We're not good at this yet, and because of the nature of the end-of-life litigation I do, when I do wills and powers of attorney, I pay particular attention to this, but I know that lots of lawyers focus on the estate planning, follow the money, not the end of life, because they don't know anything about it, they didn't teach this in law school, and who wants to talk about dying anyway? Your lawyer also probably won't make you promise to talk to your substitute decision makers to ensure they understand your wishes, your values, and beliefs. And I have seen people tormented over, what would Dad want me to do while he's here in a hospital bed with no hope of recovery? How long should I keep him here? You need to empower your decision makers to make the decisions that you want them to make. No one else can do this for you. You need to have these conversations. Your lawyer also is unlikely to know about the consent and capacity board process, which is a whole other topic that I'll come back another day for. Your doctors also aren't going to ask the probing questions to help you pick the right attorney for personal care. They're not going to make you promise to talk to your substitute decision makers. And although they have the right in many cases, they do not initiate the consent and capacity board process to resolve disputes, and I'm a bit of a cynic. There are two reasons for that. One is it takes them away from billable clients, and the other is they don't know enough about it. Okay, so here's something about choosing the wrong decision makers. Your spouse, especially if your spouse is older than you and already showing senility, bad choice. Your children, except they can't ever agree on the time of day, never mind whether or not to send mom to a nursing home. Have you ever seen families where one kid says it's 2 o'clock Tuesday afternoon and the other one says, no, it's not, it's 2 a.m. Monday morning? Okay? These people together are going to make your end-of-life decisions for you, going to manage your money, going to decide whether or not or when you should go into a nursing home. That's never going to work. What about your brother, the one who swore an oath of silence and lives in an ashram in the Tibetan foothills? Bad choice again. Or what about your sister who doesn't believe in modern medicine? Oh, no, he doesn't need heart bypass surgery. Give him shark cartilage and essence of wheat germ. Listen, I'm not smart enough to make this stuff up, okay? Like these come from cases, these come from examples of other people's misery that I'm sharing with you to help you avoid your misery. How do you choose the right decision maker? Well, someone who generally cares about you, that's pretty obvious. Will be capable, available, and willing to make these decisions for you. And sometimes they're not easy. And sometimes it takes time. And sometimes it takes time and time and time again, because health is not a static situation for most of us. Also knows your wishes, values, and beliefs, and will respect them. Okay? I happen to believe in blood transfusions, if necessary. I'm not appointing a Jehovah's Witness my attorney for personal care out of respect for his or her beliefs, as well out of respect for my own self-preservation. It's both things that come into play in that situation. Also, you need somebody who will educate themselves about your condition and your prognosis. And I will tell you this, in the 21st century, in the hospital system, anywhere in the world, no matter how good it is, you need somebody to advocate for you. You need somebody to ask questions. Yes, ma'am.
I think I've had my conversation. My son's wife, uncle died, and she and her two sisters had to do all the stuff. And he said, you know, there's so much to think about. He said, for instance, you want to be kept alive? You know, just ask this other group, do you want to be kept alive? I said, if I can't live the vigorous life I've always lived, absolutely not.
Define vigorous. Not to me, to them, okay? You know, just by the way, I drive a very old car. It's got almost 300,000 miles on it. Well, when it was brand new, if the passenger seat didn't go up and down the same way the driver's seat did, I'd be taking it back to the shop and screaming at them, you sold me a brand new car and it doesn't work. Well, at 300,000 kilometers, I really don't care whether the passenger seat works or not. My values have changed about my car, and for that matter, about myself, because we're both gray, and it's not a bad thing.
But I want to have a purpose to life and be able to live it.
Whatever that means at the time. Hold your question. I'll save some time at the end, I hope, for questions. Okay? So here are some things you should never say unless you really mean them. I never want to go to a nursing home. Well, guess what? Nobody does. Well, so is it that you never want to go to a nursing home, or is it that you don't want to go to a nursing home but you recognize that one day you might have to? So what you really mean is, I never want to go to a nursing home, but for God's sake, don't leave me at home to starve to death, to be miserable without cable television, if that's important to you, if I can't manage to handle these things on my own. I don't want to go to a nursing home. I recognize I might have to. Okay. Do everything. So in a hearing I was at a few weeks ago, the doctor said to the tribunal, well, we can keep Mr. Jones alive probably for the next 40 or 50 years. Now, mind you, alive only according to the strict legal definition of life, because Mr. Jones is already 92 years old. They can keep him alive, what'll be left of him in half a century. Do everything is a very scary thing to ask for, because you might get it. Don't let me die. Well, that's in the same category, isn't it, as do everything. And that's all I have to say, but if there are some questions, I'd be pleased to take them. And I'll share one of my favorite cartoons with you. Does it hurt when my lawyer touches you there? Do I have time for questions? Do I?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Do people ever have temporary power of attorneys? Like if they're going on a trip and they want to give somebody a 1 month?
Absolutely. And
Can you repeat the question?
okay, sure. The question was, do people ever have temporary powers of attorney, for example, going on vacation? Absolutely, regarding a power of attorney for property. You need somebody.
I was more thinking of personal care.
Well, the answer for personal care is there's no need to make it temporary because it doesn't kick in until you lose the ability to make your own decisions. With a power of attorney for property, I can appoint an attorney for property to manage my affairs, whether I'm capable or incapable, and that's a valid document from the moment it's lawfully and completely properly executed. Power of attorney for personal care doesn't kick in until there's a finding of incapacity. So,
Right, so if you died or were quite ill overseas, you were giving your travel companion the power to make some decisions.
depends who I'm traveling with.
It does. But
Not my sisters. At least not all three of them together, that's for sure. But yeah, no, you can do that. The other interesting aspect of that, though, is in a lot of situations, doctors don't pay attention to who the correct decision maker should be. There's a warm body that's good enough. And I'll give you an example about that. My mother.
no authority in.
Well, my mother in her mid-80s developed cancer. And so we got her into an outpatient program in one of the most prominent and well-respected cancer hospitals in the world, which shall remain nameless but is on University Avenue in downtown Toronto, and its initials are Princess Margaret. And so one of my sisters is retired, and she arranges to take Mother for the regular treatments every second Tuesday. But she was out of the country once, and so I took Mother to her appointment. And we walk in to see the doctor, and the doctor looked at me and said, "Oh, I was hoping your sister would be here today." And I said, "Well, why were you hoping my sister would be here today?" "Well, because we need to adjust your mother's medication, and I needed consent from her." And this poor doctor's talking to the wrong lawyer about this. I said, "Well, are you sure my mother's incapable?" Looked at my mother, and my mother knows when to be quiet and let me have fun. So mother just sat there and looked back at the doctor and said, "Well, your sister was doing all the talking." I said, "Yeah, but how do you know my mother's incapable?" "Oh, well," and I said, "Oh, just by the way, how do you know that my sister is my mother's substitute decision maker?" Now we're flipping through the chart looking for something, and there's nothing there because they don't have anything in the chart for substitute decision making. And finally the poor doctor looked at me and said, "Well, isn't she?" I said, "Well, doctor, perhaps you'd like to have a copy of my mother's power of attorney for personal care to put into her chart, in which you'll see I'm the decision maker for my mother." "Oh. Okay, then." Anyway, and just by the way, we
A warm body near.
a warm body, yeah, and sometimes that's the best you can do. I mean, if I break my leg and knock myself unconscious, walking through the markets of Marrakesh, and I get taken to a hospital in Marrakesh, and the doctor says to whoever showed up with me, I'm going to have to set his leg and pour cold water on him to wake him up. Is that okay with you? Well, that's good enough as far as I'm concerned at that moment. You know, most doctors, I'm not, please understand, I'm not imputing any malice or bad faith to doctors. And in fact, to the contrary, I've met very few doctors that I would not trust. But they're more interested in getting the job done than they are in respecting the autonomy of my proper decision-making process. Okay, more questions? Was that a good picture of me? Do you need another one?
Mark, I've got a question for you. You had mentioned that you often do videotaping when you interview your clients or
Yes.
people that said you went to speak to people. Can you speak to that topic of videotaping?
Yeah, as I said, other lawyers not infrequently retain me to go to hospitals and care facilities to do wills and powers of attorney for people whose capacity they're not certain about. Because of my time on the Consent and Capacity Board and my experience, I have a better awareness of how to probe a person's capacity, if you will, than most lawyers do. And so they value that expertise because I can do a will same day. So I take my laptop and my portable printer and I go to the hospital and I get the instructions and then I go downstairs, have a coffee and prepare the documents. Well, one of the reasons those lawyers are retaining me is recognizing that Mrs. Jones's children are going to fight over the changes that she wants to make to her will or to her power of attorney. And you don't get paid well to do a will or a power of attorney, but you get paid very well to litigate an estate. And so they'd rather I do the POA, and then I'm in the witness box explaining why this is a valid document, and they're making all this great money through the trial. Well, I discovered about myself that I just don't do a good enough job taking notes any longer, if I ever did. About all the questions that I ask to satisfy myself the person is capable, or in some cases incapable. I don't do a good enough job taking notes. It's tough enough paying attention to the questions I have to ask, never mind writing down the verbatim the questions and answers. So I video record the whole interview, both of them. I video record the initial interview at which I'm getting the instructions, and I video record the second interview at which we're executing the documents. And that achieves the following. First of all, it's a far better record than anybody's note-taking. Secondly, it allows me to concentrate on what I'm doing rather than concentrate on taking notes about what I'm doing. And thirdly, it avoids litigation. So in a few occasions, I've had phone calls from the lawyers who retained me. Mark, you got a copy of Mrs. Jones's video? Yeah, I do. Good. Send it over. Her daughter is about to contest the will on the basis that mom wasn't capable when she executed it. Daughter's lawyer sees the video and says to daughter, you're going to lose. End of conversation. And so I've done my job by protecting our clients' wishes from attack. Now, some lawyers don't like that because there's an old saying amongst us to the effect that no estate should ever be frittered away on the beneficiaries. So just by the way, if you don't have a good will or a good power of attorney for personal care, if you haven't spoken to the people who will be making your decisions for you, if you haven't empowered them to make the decisions that you want them to make for you, then on behalf of the legal profession, I thank you for contributing to our estates.
One more question.
Yes, ma'am.
I've asked rather a lot of questions, so I don't like asking another one. But I'm from out of town originally, where I had a very good lawyer.
Would you be further than from out of town? Like, I'm just guessing from the accent. It doesn't sound like Kingston, Ontario to me.
No, but
Okay.
about that distance. And how do you find a good lawyer? Now that's a very elementary question to you, but it's a very difficult question to me because I'm not married, I've never been married, and I don't know where to find a good lawyer.
You call the Law Society of Upper Canada Lawyer Referral Service.
Thank you.
They have, and you tell them why you want a lawyer, and they will give you the names of lawyers who practice in that field. That's one approach. Another approach is you ask people you know if they've got a good lawyer. And sometimes they will warn you away from a lawyer rather than send you to a lawyer, which is probably just as useful as anything else. Thirdly, before you go to see that lawyer or even make the phone call to set up the appointment, Google them. Okay? I mean, most lawyers in the 21st century in Ontario have websites of some description. Okay, don't Google me. You're going to discover that in an earlier life I wrote restaurant reviews. Okay? Am I done?
I think so.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen.